Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to you to this online public lecture hosted by the South African Archaeological Society. I'm very grateful to the ASAPA Council and the organizing committee for kindly inviting me to talk at this 2022 biennial meeting of our association. As we reflect about the theme for this year, archaeology and society in Southern Africa, I would like to make some brief remarks concerning one of the great challenges of engaging the public or the so-called local communities, as it became quite a popular way of describing part of our practice. So professional archaeologists are self-defined custodians of an important section of African past, whose primary professional duty and ethical responsibility is to stir and care for the protection of the past for the benefit of the present and future generations. Accordingly, public education and outreach are critical to convey the message that stewardship of archaeological heritage is important. This garners support for what we do as archaeologists and aims to make a general public and particularly local communities appreciatives of the values and of archaeology and heritage. Yet, power asymmetries in terms of archaeological production and management of African past still expose the colonial legacies in many aspects of archaeology. This is despite significant changes that have occurred over the years to counteract the colonial underpinnings of the discipline. A key issue is that the past, which archaeologists frequently talked of in terms of belonging to the people, i.e. the public and local communities more specifically, of present and the future has been and continues to be somehow colonized by the archaeology through their discourse and practices. In addition, archaeological heritage has been relentlessly promoted as potential socio-economical driver, mostly for impoverished communities. Yet, a closer look into community benefit through heritage reveals that negative results are far more common than the positive ones. While many heritage places across Africa, especially World Heritage sites, are discursively constructed as important for the economic growth and development of local communities living near those sites. Most promoters of participatory approaches to management of heritage have actively marginalized local communities, causing them to lose social capital and relinquish their control over heritage sites. The interpretation of what constitutes participation differs from one context to the other. The degree of participation, including the rights of frequently poor local communities to use material remains of the past, depend on the political will of state officials, archaeologists, heritage experts, and the list goes on. So this brief reflection aims to provide some notes of some of the work and the realization of my own experience on several issues, I would not say problems, both with the discourse and practice regarding the community participation and the notion of benefit through heritage management that has come to shape the relationship between archaeologists, heritage practitioners, and various segments of the public, especially those considered to be local communities within Southern Africa. So I would like to start with a short review of what the preoccupation with community, or what I would call the community turn in terms of environmental conservation in Southern Africa. So in the region, the preoccupation with the participation of local communities in heritage management, here referred most of the time as community conservation discourse, was developed within the framework of the so-called community-based natural resource management programs. In line with the rise of social movements and ideas around more just international economic order in the 1970s, conservation initiatives drew on notions of participatory engagement, indigenous knowledge and community needs in pursuit of social justice, poverty reduction, and biodiversity conservation. While starting from a financial concern about conservation, increasingly the community conservation discourse argued that because local community already rely and manage natural resources, they were most suited to conserve them to the external assistance. In the eyes of academics and international environmental actors, local communities were no longer to be seen merely as victims of ecological breakdown, but instead assumed to hold some part of the solution of those problems. Through active participation, local community might benefit from economic assets occurring from tourism. This was considered a key element to guarantee the success of those conservation projects. In addition, the idea of sustainable development led to a renewed global commitment to identifying local specific ways of knowing and responding to environmental problems, and resulted in a substantial flow of funds from the Western nations through development agencies anxious to finance this new grassroots approach to conservation. So this community-based resource management was at the beginning commonly seen and continues to a certain degree as having two central objectives: to enhance conservation of wildlife biodiversity and the provision of economic, social, cultural, and political benefits to the local populations. Although initiated to respond to the local concerns, mostly in countries such as Zimbabwe and Zambia with programs such as Campfire and others, this management style was promoted by international donor organizations as part of the broader liberalization process led by international organizations such as a World Bank or International Monetary Fund, which were considered necessary for the development and the democratization of the so-called Third World. So this new approach was portrayed as decentralized mechanism aimed at giving local communities the power to control their resources. And aligned with this notion of participation in sustainable development, one of those community-based natural resource management program most appealing theoretical strength lay on its ability to support the discourse of a win-win solution for both biodiversity and local communities. So despite the soundness of this underlying concept, most critics who have argued that the main reason why such approach in general has become hegemonic is not because it aimed to ratify the problems of the past in terms of conservation, namely the fortress approach to conservation, but it provided a theoretical benefit of such a wide scale that it firstly enabled many actors with divergent agendas to crowd under a common umbrella, and thus enable the discourse to produce and reproduce its own success. So the discursive power of the theoretical benefits of environmental and community conservation, the need to proclaim success to other international audience, and the diffuses range of social and environmental objectives all lie behind the representation of this success. So the community-based natural resource management program was able to hybridize with the currently dominant political ideology of neoliberalism. Within the neoliberal conservation paradigm, these programs provide equations that benefit alike the investors, the corporate world, the national economies, biodiversity, local community, Western consumers, international funding organization, and many others, the so-called non-government organizations. So while advocates of this community-based approach proclaim the success, a broader reading of case studies across the region also reveals that the actual results on the ground are due to multiple other factors, and given the lack of time, I would not describe all of them here, but I would like to focus on three. So the first one concerns inadequate policies given the divergent views and goals of the agendas of the main actors involved. So most government policies that govern participation of local people in heritage devolve this responsibility for such management to local people without giving them the decision-making authority. Since the interests of the central state do not allow for a real reconfiguration of power in favor of local communities, expectation of improved custodianship of change in attitude by local communities have not been met in many cases, as illustrated by examples in Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and others. So the way in which those community-based programs is form, promote, and institutionalize is the outcome of often conflicting interests of participating decision makers whose values, understanding, motives span from local to international levels. So the international donors have their own agenda: decentralization, liberalization, sustainable development, protection of outstanding universal value when it comes to world heritage. And one can mention some others as well. For in its turn, central governments attempt to propagate their own ideology and to strengthen their control over often rural constituencies. So various agencies promote their goals and local officials introduce their own personal aspirations and power play. As a result, some actors such as government and funding agencies often use their discursive power, invoking nations of consultation, involvement, participation, joint management, to make unrealistic promises in order to secure the approval and participation of the supposed beneficial local communities. Local actors can also embark on such projects for other reasons rather than conservation. Another element obviously goes to the old question on whose notion of participation. So although the so-called participation of communities in conservation initiative became a central piece of this community-based approach, the interpretation of participation often varies widely. Some projects do not go beyond passive participation, which means an unilateral announcement is made by the external professionals from either the government or NGOs without listening to communities' opinions and consent. In another project, participation is reduced to consultation, in which local people answer questions designed by outsiders. Another common undertaking is that the functional participation, where local people from groups to meet already predetermined objectives and often involve the development of external initiated local committees. Such participatory approach need not to occur at early stage of the project cycle or planning. It often occurs after major decisions have been made. Genuine interactive participation, including joint analysis leading to action plans and the formulation of new local groups, are rare. Given the wide range of notions of participation, it is possible for different actors in a participatory project to proceed as if they are working to the same agenda, when in fact, antagonist pathways are being forged. So in many countries in the region, participation of local communities within such community-based programs is framed in terms of devolution, but what the multiple actors actually do on the ground varies considerably from one country to another and from one project to the other. Thus, the interpretation of what constitutes participation or devolution differs from one context to another, and the degree of participation, including the right of the often poor rural communities to use natural resources, depend on the political will of government department and government officials. In fact, many officials feel that the state should control access and decision-making over resources and heritage, and that communities should be passive participants. For those officials, and I would add some professionals in the field, often purely equipped to deal with the people-centered approach to heritage, the purpose of involving the local communities is for them to become aware of their new role and function in the conservation policy or framework. Consequently, in many national policy documents, participation or responsibility towards the management of heritage is not framed from the community's point of view. Thus, participation is often the decision-making process which does not involve the key element in that participation, meaning the public or the community. So participation is often seen as a means to get people to support predetermined conservation projects. And lastly, one can always think of the elusive nature of local communities. So the participatory approach advocate in most of our region policies that are often premised on the homogeneous notion of community, even though it is always proclaimed that we, as archaeologists, we understand that the communities are multiply constituted. So the expectation that local people, as geographical confined and marginalized units, speak with one voice, practice collective participation, and shares a single vision, encompass the aspiration of the group, who have a strong sense of stewardship to both natural and cultural resources. And this has proven over and over a very romanticized and approach and view. Yet, frequently, once funds are allocated for such project, the first step is to identify the recipient community, which, following consultation with the existing residents or close neighbors, become the community. It has long been acknowledged that local grouping constantly redefine and realign themselves and reformulate their objectives. Community, however defined, is rarely an undifferentiated homogeneous whole, but includes many, at times conflicting interests. Inside a community, there are individuals with different personal aspirations who are not all interested in the altruistic community development, empowerment, environmental conservation, heritage protection, and so on. It has been also demonstrated that the voice of disenfranchised community members remain unheard, while the voice of the elite with access to means and power often dominates. So the apolitical approach to community adopted by mostly on those community-based projects does not take into account of this internal diversity, nor of the power relations and the macro politics among local actors. So advocates of the community-based approach seem to be more concerned with presenting an image of a conservationists working harmoniously with the local community to achieve altruist conservation goals, brushing aside conflict resulting from the historical and macro-political context, as well as the current dynamics at play at the locality. For example, the concept of broader roles assigned to local communities within the decentralization process, the impact of foreign intervention at the local level, the political conflict among local actors and groups within the current multi-party system, the experience of local actors to deal with and to take advantage of foreign actors' intervention, all those constitute considerable challenges for an effective engagement with the public. So the romanticized idea of local communities has often blinded implementers of the so-called community-based approaches to the reality of these intra-community conflicts. Many of those conflicts have emerged in the course of implementation of projects, for instance, between elected representative and co-management organization, traditional leadership who often expect their share of the benefit from those developments by virtue of only their traditional position. So much of this rhetoric about community-based management in Southern Africa is yet to be materialized. So participation is still often seen as the means to get people to support predetermined conservation paradigms, and community participation has often been mere window washing. The notion of community conservation exacerbates inequalities between local communities on one side and national government and private organizations on the other. In fact, the above analysis of the community conservation discourse seem to suggest the persistence of colonial paradigms embedded in the long criticized and supposedly abandoned very sort of conservation or Western approaches to conservation in places like Africa, with the idea that people have no place in terms of the management of both nature and cultural heritage. Hence, the conservation must be defended against local people by force of coercion is necessary when it comes to nature. At the same time, it appears that this approach and those paradigms still alive and well, and has in some cases seen major reinforcement depending on the position that we take as archaeologists. As we borrow from a number of those approaches that were developed in the realm of conservation and management of natural resources. So this account of local community participation in environmental conservation in Southern Africa, I hope, provides some interesting insights into the notion of community participation, its discourse, and its associated practice, which shape notions and approaches to cultural heritage management across the region. The combined analysis of those participatory approaches to conservation and management of both natural and cultural heritage, I believe, provide insightful views into the disjuncture between the discourse and the actual practice regarding local communities' involvement and the participation in the heritage management in Africa. And I would like to finalize by also addressing another important point, which relates to the notion of community, which is the notion of community benefit through heritage management. So as it has been referred by Ian Meskel, recent efforts to preserve cultural heritage in the region has been shaped by the notion that heritage must pay. So heritage has been relentlessly promoted as potential social economic driver for most communities, particularly those in the face of declining government services and failed delivery. Yet, some scholars have demonstrated that if we then look very closely to some of those community benefit discourse through heritage, we might find that negative results are far more common than the positive ones. In fact, in Southern Africa, we found that the government shift to liberal policies in the 80s and 90s was accompanied by this strong promotion of tourism based on the assumption that economic growth will eradicate poverty. So the niche area of cultural heritage-based tourism has been increasingly regarded as one of the most significant and fast-growing parts of tourism sector, able to provide opportunities for job creation, infrastructure development, public awareness, education opportunities in both rural and urban areas. In particular, with focus, archaeological sites with the World Heritage status have been seen, like other World Heritage sites, as a potential catalyst for improving livelihoods of local communities and generating considerable income to the state. Thus, for instance, in South Africa, we found that the considerable investment that was made, for instance, as described by Benjamin Smith and Melanie Duval in their study about the Drakensberg, that although the considerable investment that was made through the government poverty relief fund on developing public rock cut sites in the Drakensberg, the results of those efforts were far from what was expected in terms of the initiatives and the government input. And these will turn then created the assumption that the investment in rock cut will then create the benefit for the South Africa, not only by informing and educating the local communities and the visitors, but also to promote the South Africa, the new, the identity of the new South Africa, and to help guarantee a long-term protection of rock art. So the failure of, in this case, the rock art to act as this driver for tourists in the region, and in most of the region, with some exceptions, such as, for instance, the Fontaine site in Namibia, and others. But in general, this failure to poor communication between the main actors responsible for promotion of tourism and the preservation of rock art, and also the persistence of tourism markets of the region, which continue to focus extremely on areas such as the promotion of the environment and the natural heritage, such as in the case of the Maluti Drakensberg, which is also inscribed on UNESCO World Heritage List, both under natural criteria for each biodiversity and ecological processes, but also because of this remarkable rock art. So even in situations where one can argue that the community benefit, this course is framed not only in terms of economic terms, but even symbolic reparations, one can still found that the community consultation is often a token gesture by professionals and authorities of such community initiatives, and the sponsoring, for instance, of in recent cases where we see the construction of memorials and monuments as a way of redressing past injustices does not really reflect what people value about the past and how they would actually like to see their heritage and history represented, but more in the institutionalized projects in the form of commemoration that is sponsored mostly at central government. So to conclude, I would like to suggest that a brief scrutiny into this community benefit through heritage reveal that although some sites have generated some form of economic improvement, such as the knock-on effect generated by global tourism, seem to be limited. The local communities are yet to see, in most cases, significant improvement in their lives. And recently, we have to add the impact of COVID has really exacerbated such situation. Similarly, meaningful community reparation, recognition, or restitution through heritage cannot be achieved in most cases due to the lack of a meaningful consultation, and also in other cases, political party appropriation and distortion of community memories of the past. So despite much of this rhetoric to the contrary, consultation is often short-circuit and reduced to patronizing tokenism process, and especially when approaching date of important anniversaries and public events. So what we often see is that professionals and public officials want to be seen to engage in consultation, but legitimated through the democratic mandate, sometimes make decisions to suit their own political ends, disguised as broader societal goals. And despite all this challenge and limitation discussed above, the notion of community benefits through celebration of heritage continues to thrive. As we are all encouraged to think about the contribution that we make to our broader society as a whole, particularly as the world continues to face a difficult context brought about by COVID and other uncertainties, I hope we continue our reflection on how to make participation a meaningful concept when it comes to archaeologist engagement with the public. I wish you all a fruitful and insightful ASAPA conference. I thank you for your attention.